By spring 1944, Hitler's armies were in full retreat across the Ukraine. The Soviet leadership now poured in ever greater quantities of men and equipment. The Germans had two excellent tanks, the Tiger I and the Panzer Mark V Panther. Both were well suited to the sort of mobile defensive warfare which was the only remaining hope for the German armies on the Eastern Front. But the Red Army had at least twice as many tanks, mostly the battle-tried T-34, and armament factories in Siberia were turning out more at a rate of 2,000 a month. While Hitler was forced to divide his forces between a war on two fronts, Stalin's war machine was working flat out. 6 million Soviet troops faced less than 3 million Germans. In early January 1944, the forces of the First Ukrainian Front moved in from the north on the German-held town of Korsun. It was the last German toehold on what they'd hoped would be their defensive line along the river Dnieper. 12 days later, the forces of the Second Ukrainian Front drove forward on the southern side. The attack followed a by now well-established Soviet pattern. First, there was a build-up of an overwhelming number of troops. The Germans were never quite sure where the first assault would come from. Then there was a devastating artillery bombardment. Next, the massed tanks of the Red Army would punch a hole through the German defenses. Finally, the infantry poured in. In Korsun, it quickly became obvious to the Germans they were about to be overwhelmed. The German commander, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, flew to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia to beg, yet again, for permission to pull out. But Hitler once more refused. After a week of fierce fighting, about 60,000 men were trapped in what became known as the Korsun Pocket. The Soviets called it Little Stalingrad. The German forces now attempted to break out. But the Russians were ready for it. T-34 tanks and Cossack horsemen harried the Germans as they tried to escape. The fighting lasted 2 days. By the time Korsun fell, the Germans had lost some 30,000 men. The Red Army forces were now moving forward at speed. Their advance was made possible by fleets of trucks, mostly provided by the United States, that kept their forces supplied. It was a much faster process than for the Germans, who still relied heavily on horses. The Russians were also dominating the skies. The Luftwaffe had always been a key part of the German war machine. But Hitler had been forced to divert many of his aircraft to defend the homeland from a US and British bomber offensive. As a result, Russian planes outnumbered the Luftwaffe 5-1. The Red Air Force's Stormvik fighter bombers took a heavy toll on German armor and supply columns. Yet Hitler refused to contemplate defeat, and now announced a new version of his no-retreat policy. He ordered the German troops to create what he called fortified areas, or local strongholds. These were to be defended to the bitter end. Only with his personal approval could any of these fortresses be abandoned. It was a desperate ploy, and would come to cost the Germans dearly. One of the first tests of the new strategy was near the Ukrainian town of Kamenets-Podolsky. Here, 20 divisions of panzers were threatened with being cut off. But Hitler declared it a fortified area and refused to allow a retreat. In the face of bitter fighting, there was a vitriolic argument between Hitler and Manstein, who could see the writing on the wall. Finally, Manstein got his way, and the panzers were given permission to break out. Ten days later, some 200,000 men of the 1st Panzer Army safely reached the German lines over 100 miles to the west. But they had lost most of their heavy equipment and weapons. By now, Manstein's requests to retreat had become too much for Hitler. The field marshal was sacked. Further south, the Germans attempted to hold back the Soviet torrent on the Yezhny Bug River. They failed, and a large force of Germans was caught behind Russian lines in the Black Sea port of Odessa. They too faced being cut off. In early April 1944, Hitler declared it a fortress. But the German troops ignored him and slipped out of the city. Several days later, on April the 10th, Odessa was liberated. Stalin was winning on all fronts. He could now turn his attention to the city that had suffered under Nazi assault for years, Leningrad. By the beginning of 1944, the Russian city of Leningrad had been under siege from German forces for nearly 2.5 years. During the first winter, almost 500,000 people had starved to death. Volunteers struggled to put out fires and construct defenses. But by 1944, life in the city had become almost unbearable. Several attempts to relieve it had failed. One effort in 1942 led to the capture of more than 50,000 troops of the Soviet Second Shock Army. Another, in 1943, had enabled a trickle of supplies to get into the city. But even so, throughout 1943, up to 20,000 people continued to die of cold, disease and starvation every month. By January 1944, however, with the Germans in headlong retreat, Stalin now turned his attention to the plight of the city. That month, Soviet forces secretly infiltrated the neighboring peninsula around Oranienburg. The attack on the German positions started with a savage 65-minute bombardment. Then Russian troops ripped into the startled German lines. At the same time, another Soviet force attacked from the northwest around the city. They too burst onto the German lines. For 3 days, the German commander, Field Marshal Georg von Köchler, held out. Finally, he asked Hitler for permission to fall back. Hitler, as always, refused. Köchler argued back, telling the Führer only a swift withdrawal would save his army from a massacre. Hitler sacked him. He was replaced by General Walter Mödel. He was known as Hitler's fireman for his fierce loyalty and avid Nazi outlook. But even to Mödel, the danger was obvious. He now disobeyed Hitler and pulled out. After 2.5 years, the siege of Leningrad was finally lifted. Nearly 1 million Russian civilians had died. Relief in the city was overwhelming. The first fallout was in neighboring pro-German Finland, which now feared a Soviet invasion. So in March 1944, a secret Finnish delegation arrived in Moscow to discuss peace. Stalin's terms were harsh. He demanded the Petsamo region in the far north of Finland, an area rich in nickel, an important ingredient in the manufacture of metal alloys. He also demanded reparations of $600 million. The Finns refused and prepared for a Soviet invasion. But Finland could wait. The Soviet High Command, or Stavka as it was known, had more pressing business further south. The Red Army offensives in the Ukraine in late 1943 had trapped 120,000 German troops in the Crimea. Hitler, as ever, had refused to allow them to withdraw. They now waited helplessly for a Soviet onslaught. In early April, 2 months after the lifting of the siege on Leningrad, it came. The troops of the 4th Ukrainian Front crashed into the Crimea from the north. At the same time, a diversionary attack landed on the western end of the peninsula. In less than a day, the Axis troops in the west had given way. They fell back on the port of Sebastopol, and Hitler ordered Fortress Sebastopol to hold out to the last man. They didn't stand a chance. Within 2 weeks of the siege, German troops were being evacuated by sea. 40,000 men escaped, but some 30,000 defenders were still trapped in the port. They retreated to the beaches south of the city, hoping to be rescued by more German ships. It didn't happen. The evacuation was interrupted by a Soviet artillery bombardment. Three days later, the Germans surrendered. Meanwhile, back in the northwest of the country, the Germans still occupied much of what is Belarus today. But the Red Army had grabbed a vast bulge of land stretching into Poland and Romania. It meant the Germans had to defend a 1,400-mile front. They were hugely overextended. Military logic suggested it was time for the Germans to withdraw to more